Hi, I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, we're reporting from the 2024 National Diversity in STEM, or NDiSTEM, conference hosted in Phoenix, Arizona by SACNAS. Several members of the AIBS team attended with the aim of helping our member societies and organizations develop an understanding of the ways in which minority-serving societies like SACNAS foster inclusive communities for scientists from traditionally marginalized backgrounds. Attending the conference was extremely rewarding, and we returned with a strong sense that the future of science will be well served by continued efforts to connect and invest in the diverse communities and perspectives representing STEM worldwide. A special thank you also to SACNAS for the opportunity and warm welcome. And you can visit sacnas.org to learn more about their programs and events, including the National Diversity in STEM Conference. And now I'm happy to share a small sample of the great conversations that I had in Phoenix with a specific focus on the science that was presented by the participants. So with no further ado, let's begin with a discussion I had with closing keynote speaker Donald Warren, who's the co-director of the Center for Indigenous Health at Johns Hopkins University and professor at the Bloomberg School. Let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me.
Very happy to be here.
So I was wondering if we could get started with perhaps a little bit of a preview of some of the things you'll be discussing in your presentation later today.
Yeah, I'll be doing the closing keynote focusing on indigenous STEM. And I think that there's probably a lot of people who work in biological sciences and other STEM arenas who don't really fully realize the extent of scientific advancements that have been developed by indigenous populations. So I'll be going over quite a few of those, including biological sciences, but also looking at engineering and other types of medical sciences.
I'm really looking forward to it. Could you give us perhaps an example for our audience who may not be as familiar?
Absolutely. So in my own training, I am a physician, but also have training in traditional Lakota medicine. So I blend modern medicine and traditional medicine. And it's really interesting. In those spaces, sometimes I get asked the question, are there any hospitals in the United States that are doing an effective job at integrating traditional indigenous medicine? And my answer is yes, every single one of them. For example, when you go to the emergency room and they suspect a heart attack, the first thing they give you is aspirin. And aspirin actually comes from willow bark.
Right.
We've been using willow bark tea for thousands of years. So now, of course, the chemists will call it an aqueous solution, and it's got acetyl salicylic acid, but it's still a healing tea that we've always used.
Yeah.
So every hospital in the country, when they suspect a myocardial infarction or a heart attack, one of the first things they give the patient is basically willow tree bark, but in this case, in the form of aspirin.
Yeah, that's a fascinating example. And I'm wondering, do you feel that sort of knowledge is appreciated? We're certainly using it, but is it not appreciated in the public sphere?
I don't think it's well known at all. I think that there's always surprise, and there's almost this perception that somehow the indigenous peoples were maybe, bumbling and fumbling through life, and then fortunately the European colonizers came and saved us and taught us carpentry. I mean, you hear all these crazy stories, but in truth, part of what I'll be talking about as well is not in the biological sciences, but if you look at the mega cities in Guatemala, the Mayan cities, and there's remarkable documentaries about these, and at that time, those Mayan cities were thriving. They were larger than any city in Europe. Actually, the most advanced civilizations and cities and engineering and all of the science and technology that went into that, the leading peoples were indigenous peoples of the Americas. Yeah. So I think it's really not very well understood or not very well taught in our schools. And perhaps I think because of colonization and the issues related to historical trauma and some of the social justice issues, I think there's a trend on behalf of the majority society to not talk about these things. They don't want to know the history and the truth. But when we uncover the history, just scratching the surface, we see how advanced our people have been scientifically for generations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's a very compelling point about the desire to shove uncomfortable things under the rug, which obviously should not be done. Can you tell me a little bit about your current role at Johns Hopkins?
Yeah, so I have several roles. So I'm principal investigator on several studies, including a diabetes study. We're also in the midst of a lung cancer study, and we're also doing several studies on traditional medicine, as well as looking at effective ways to promote healing, recovery from addiction. In addition to that, we're doing a feasibility study for an indigenous school of medicine. Well, I'll be talking about that as well today. So I do a lot of teaching, research, administration, and program development. So I like to joke my job's 50% research, 50% teaching, 50% administration, 50% service.
Yeah, it's only 200%.
Yeah, I think probably everyone out there could probably understand that dynamic.
Can you tell me a little bit about the School for Indigenous Medicine?
Yeah, so when I look at my own medical training, and I'm 58, so I went through medical school a long time ago. This is late 80s, early 90s. And there's almost a sense of pride in the idea of education by humiliation. And there's almost a sense of pride in how difficult we make it and how much we traumatize the students. It's almost the idea of where we want to break down the student and then rebuild them up into the cookie-cutter physician that we just assume is what society needs. And what I see is that populations that are historically traumatized or marginalized or going through racism and discrimination, that's a really ignorant way to train future physicians. And what I see is that we're developing traumatized scientists instead of healed healers. And when I look around the country, just looking at the data, we have 0 American Indian Medical School deans. We have 0 American Indian Public Health School deans. And this is 2024.
Yeah, it's appalling.
Yeah, so we're not underrepresented, we're unrepresented in these spaces. So we really need to fix that. So I've been working in medical education for years. Prior to joining Johns Hopkins, I was associate dean at the medical school in North Dakota, and I've worked in other academic institutions. And what I've come to realize after all these years is waiting for or trying to force current systems to change to meet the needs of indigenous peoples is really not an effective use of my time. Right. We need our own school. We need an indigenous school of medicine that's focused on healing the healers, that's focused on developing healers that are balanced themselves. And we don't do a good job of that in modern medical training. I'd say even in basic science training, I'd say PhD programs are very similar as well. Right. So that's what we'll be talking about a little bit today. But there's a model for this. There's the historically black colleges and universities. They have 4 medical schools in their network. We have tribal colleges and universities. We have 0. So I think it's high time that we have our own School of Medicine and Health Sciences that incorporates things like traditional medicine, like the story about aspirin. There's hundreds of stories like that could be incorporated, and being I think more inclusive from a cultural perspective regarding basic science education, and that we've always been scientists, but it's never been taught through an indigenous lens. And those are some of the things that we're doing in terms of curriculum development.
That sounds really exciting. What are the plans like for getting the ball rolling? And
Well, we're in the midst of a feasibility study,
Sure.
which includes the curriculum development, business plan. It's very expensive to start a new medical school.
I can imagine.
But then also looking at potential locations. And I've presented this internationally, and it's really fascinating. Our indigenous relatives in Australia, New Zealand, and across Canada want a campus of an indigenous school of medicine. So perhaps it will be eventually a network of campuses. And why shouldn't our students learn from each other regarding traditional medicine? We could have modules on traditional Hawaiian medicine, traditional Maori medicine, traditional Aboriginal medicine. And there's so much that we can learn from each other. And I think that in modern medicine, this one-size-fits-all approach that we've been taking is failing us. And I think just looking at the data, whether it's the disparities in numbers of American Indian physicians or the health disparities themselves, the current system is failing us. So let's build a better system.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And, it reminds me of, I was reading an earlier interview with you where you were discussing some of the difficulties of, achieving health equity outcomes within, a political environment that wasn't favorable to it and among the majority population. Is this sort of the next step forward, just to...
Yeah, I think so. And I'm, of course, at this point in my career, have to be very mindful of where I invest time and energy. When I was in my 30s, I felt like I had unlimited time and energy. Now that I'm in my late 50s, I don't feel that way anymore. So I think I've got so many priority areas that are meaningful and important to me and many of my colleagues. And I feel very blessed to have so many wonderful things to work on. But I do feel that for intergenerational change and really thinking about the future, the Indigenous School of Medicine, I think, will have a huge impact.
That's very exciting, and I won't take up any more of your time. I'll let you get back to meeting and chatting with folks, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, James.
All right, and next up, I chatted with three great guests who are affiliated with ESSA, which I'll let them explain along with introducing themselves. They were involved in multiple presentations at NDiSTEM, and it was a great conversation, so let's go straight to it. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's good to be here.
It's so awesome.
We're very excited, so yeah.
All right, how about some introductions?
Hi, my name is Lizzie Colon. I'm a graduate student at ASU. I focus in American Indian Studies. I'm an Afro-Boricua from New York, and I'm also an ESSA scholar.
Hi, my name is Edauri Navarro Perez. I am the ESSA scholar. ESSA means Earth System Science for the Anthropocene, or ESSA postdoc too. And recently finished my PhD in environmental sciences. I am Boricua too, and yeah, pretty much that's it.
I'll take this one. Yeah. Hi, I'm Nancy Grimm. I am a Regents Professor at Arizona State University and the co-director of the Earth System Science for the Anthropocene Graduate Scholars Network, which these two people are part of, and also a lifetime member of SACNAS.
Okay, so just to get us started, why don't you tell us, in whatever order, a little bit about what sessions you'll be participating in at the meeting today, tomorrow, next day.
I can start with that. So ESSA, we have two sessions that we're leading. The first one is the Weaving Relations, a proactive approach to building cohort identity towards a diverse and inclusive STEM. And then the second one is Liberating Indigenous Sciences on the Wholeness of Knowledge and Subjugation of TEK. We are very excited about that, and we also have a booth that people should go and join us and ask questions so they can join ESSA.
I'm excited this is my first conference, and I'm going to be presenting on what is the importance of STEAM and the Liberating Indigenous Sciences presenting part. And yeah, I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited to be here to see and talk about how art can be included in STEM.
And I am oddly opening our session on weaving relations this afternoon, but then I have to run to teach a class. So I'm just going to be here for a bit and then come back and try to catch the end of the other session. And then most of the time I think I'll be here sitting in the booth and wandering around the booths because, at SACNAS, that's a really big thing to go to the expo. There's a lot of people that are going to look at graduate programs and various things like that at SACNAS, and so that's probably what I'll do.
That's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to checking out the booths. I just got here moments ago, immediately before we started recording. But I was hoping you could maybe tell me a little bit about ESSA. What is ESSA? What are the goals?
Okay, so yeah, we just say ESSA and assume people know, but it stands for Earth Systems Science for the Anthropocene, and when we say Earth Systems, we really are talking about all parts of Earth, not just the living things and the animals, but the plants and the planet and so forth. And then Anthropocene is obviously this age that we're in, where of very rapid change, where things are really changing. And really, we are a network of graduate scholars at ASU. So we're not a program. We bring together students from across the university, from engineering to art to life sciences to earth sciences to American Indian Studies. And we just ask that everyone who's part of ESSA sort of agree to sort of three core values that we have. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk and say what they are, but I mean...
So some of the values that we have is embedded, like we want to make sure that the research that we're doing is community embedded and is solution oriented for the problems of the Anthropocene that we have right now. We also want to make sure that it's transdisciplinary, so it's like also outside from academia, it's within the communities too.
And we want to ensure that we are centering justice, equity, and diversity, inclusion in all of our research and activities in ESSA. And then there's one more thing. Do you remember? Okay. It's we seek to appreciate and respect different ways of knowing, different knowledge systems.
Okay, and I'm guessing, I'm wondering, what's the importance of transdisciplinarity and community involvement in, addressing the problems of the Anthropocene? What does that sort of approach give us that we might not see necessarily through what many might perceive to be a more traditional, approach?
Yeah, I guess clearly to me it's that the problems that we're facing are so big. There's no one discipline or no one sector in society that is going to have all the answers. And so we're really going to have to learn how to work together, listen to each other's perspectives, listen to the kinds of solutions that might actually be out there that we haven't thought of before because of a dominance of Western science thinking or Western economic thinking or whatever. And so it's really just to open it up to more voices and more potential solutions. And it looks like Lizzie wants to say something.
Because I think, especially connecting to what you're saying, that's where the A in STEAM comes from. For me, I come from an art background. I went to a performing arts school, got my bachelor's in English, and then I gained my master's in social science. And that was a big transition for me. And being a part of ESSA has allowed me to not only work with those who are in physical science, but I can also embrace my art background and my ways of knowing into my research and with others as well. It's very bridging the gap, as we would say, with in the physical sciences and indigenous ways of knowing as well.
And I think also a big important thing about transdisciplinary and what we're doing ESSA is that historically a lot of communities have not been included, and they are experiencing a lot of the changes. I mean, everybody experiencing the changes in the world, but like some communities are experiencing greater degree these changes in the world. So I think it's very important to make sure that like we are working with those that are experiencing the major effects of like climate change and things like that. So we are very aware of those issues, and we want to make sure that like how research has been done in the past that a lot of times could produce some harm. We're trying to make sure of like how can we make things better.
Right. So is that a case in which those who have been historically marginalized, if they're not appropriately included in the process, the solutions you come up with will continue to sustain that marginalization, and you won't get just solutions, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because accessibility is a really big issue in academia. And if we're not using language that's inclusive to marginalized communities, if we're not using teaching methods or methodology that's inclusive, how is everyone going to collaborate on different forms of knowledge systems? So, yeah.
That makes a ton of sense. I'm hoping you can give me maybe a quick preview of your talks today. I think we've got the titles already, but what are some big themes that I should be on the lookout for as I sort of run around and try to be in 8 different places at once?
Well, our session is going to actually feature some introductions by some of us to what ESSA is and what the weaving relations activities are, and then people's experiences with that. But then we are going to use a big chunk of the time to actually have discussions with the participants about what they think about these ways that we are doing this.
Yes, that's our first session, that is the weaving relations. And I think that what is really special about that session is that people can learn about the different perspectives that like what goes on of like creating these types of like projects, and then like how people experience these projects by doing the research, like the students and the faculty too, and the core values that go, the intention. It's not only the intention but also the action that is informed by that intention of like creating these type of spaces. And the second one that we have that is liberating sciences, in liberating indigenous sciences, we are very excited to talk about how in a lot of spaces that want to highlight traditional ecological knowledge is still there is kind of like a divide in between ecology and traditional ecological knowledge, when a lot of times when students are doing that type of research, they are informed by both different types of perspectives and understandings. And that session is it's critical, and it's criticizing how sometimes we are not even, like, when we use traditional ecological knowledge and we try to like push it to the Western science, it's not really like liberating anybody. So it's a critical lens of like how we can do that, and the experiences, and how people have worked on like liberating their research and their science in many different levels.
I think also I would say that this idea is, a lot of people say, well, what we need to do is we need to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into what we're doing. And what we're saying, what this session will be exploring, is the idea of, it's not about incorporation. It's about how we actually can use that knowledge, respect that knowledge as equally as we do Western science. And that's really gets back to our core values of respecting these different ways of knowing.
Well, that's very exciting, and I appreciate all of the insights, and I'm really, really looking forward to these sessions. Thank you all very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and I realize I'm standing between you and perhaps lunch, so I will now stop talking and just say thank you. Appreciate it, and looking forward to the rest of the meeting.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And next up, I'm very glad to share a great conversation that I had with Dr. Naomi Lee, who is an associate professor at Northern Arizona University and also one of the featured speakers at the conference. Let's go to it. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so I really enjoyed your featured talk today, and I was wondering if you could just let us know what some of the key themes were there.
Right, it was really about embracing your identity and gaining a sense of belonging in STEM, especially for underserved or underrepresented students. And that's what I really wanted to emphasize, that even though I was a young person and I didn't feel welcomed, that narrative can change now for the young people.
Yeah, I mean, and do you feel like that oftentimes happens through organizations like SACNAS? What's the mechanism like, and what was it like for you?
Right. So again, as I mentioned in my talk, I went to a conference similar to this, and when I walked in, it totally changed my perspective on what STEM was and being an Indigenous person in STEM. And again, I feel the students that come to events like this, it's probably the same feeling that they have, where they're like, "Oh, there's other people like me." Right.
So yeah, I've heard similar themes in the past. It sounds like it's a sense of seeing yourself as a scientist.
Right. Yeah, and unfortunately, when I walked into a conference like this, it was almost 20 years ago. Not trying to date myself, but that narrative unfortunately hasn't changed too much for some people in certain areas of the country. Right. If you're in an area where there's a lot more diversity, right, you might see other people like you. But in some places, there are students who are by themselves. And this is a great place for them to realize that they're not alone.
Do you think it comes down to students being able to travel to meetings like this one? Is that should that be a key goal?
Yeah, I think that's really important. So if they're at an institution where they don't have a SACNAS chapter or another organization like this, having the university really put forward to send students to events like this, I think is really important. It says a lot about the institution themselves.
Right. And let's chat a little bit about some of the things that you work on as a scientist. So what have you been up to and researching lately?
Yeah, I'm very broad. I cross the spectrum of many fields. So in my actual research lab, we focus on vaccine research. So using chemistry and biology tools to address vaccine design, specifically targeting diseases that are health disparities in Native communities. Right. So cervical cancer, we also are looking at pancreatic cancer, and now more recently we just published on the opioid epidemic in a paper that we were addressing oxycodone. But then I cross the spectrum and I do some health literacy research as well, and then also studying HPV and the microbiome in Native women throughout the state of Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, and do you feel like that practice and your areas of focus are informed by your background? Is that something that kind of?
Oh, absolutely. I grew up as a bench scientist,
sure,
and I always enjoyed bench science, but I didn't know how to apply that to my field. And it wasn't until I started to be more advanced and gain these additional trainings, such as the Native Investigator Development Program, And then just networking with people such as at this conference, where I learned that I could really start to use my basic science knowledge to address health disparities in many different ways.
Yeah, and I mean, has that experience been, a gratifying way of sort of bringing everything together? I mean, what's it like?
Yeah, exactly. So my research lab, we actually have a vision and a mission.
Sure.
So the overall vision is essentially just reducing health disparities in Native communities and increasing underrepresented students in STEM. But the mission itself is really looking at addressing health disparities by developing novel peptide and protein-based therapeutics, and then trainings. I have many diverse students in my lab, training the next generation.
You just told me in a moment that when we were off microphone that you worked on a high school program. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Right. So I've been working with high school students since I was a postdoc at the National Institutes of Health. But then when I started at Northern Arizona University, I developed what's called the Cultural and Academic Research Experience. It's a program intended for high school students to help them transition into research positions and into the STEM fields. And so these students are able to come to NAU, gain research experience, get paid, but then we also, again, culture is the first word in our program name. We're really trying to make them feel that they belong in the STEM fields. And so that's one of the highlights of my career, is working with the high school students.
Great. And, what sorts of next steps do you envision?
Well, I can't say it officially, but look for some very big news. We will be receiving a very large federal grant to expand the program, to reach more students, and to also do some training with Native serving educators. So when that comes out, I will be sure to send it with you. But as far as research, right, we're still working. I have mostly undergrad, so we're still working on developing different vaccines. But again, our HPV microbiome project, that one is really starting to get bigger. And so this year we were just refunded from the National Cancer Institute, and we're looking to hopefully recruit more women and to look at longitudinal data collection at HPV and the microbiome.
Yeah, that was a fascinating talk you gave earlier. And I'm wondering, you mentioned students, and you mentioned earlier that you're having lunch with your students. Did you bring students to this meeting, and how are they liking it?
Yeah, I have many students here. I have students that are currently in my lab. I have students that were in my high school program that are now undergraduates. I have students that had graduated and are now at different institutions. And so it was great to see, especially the ones that have gone on and are in PhD programs or other types of programs that I didn't even know were going to be here. They just came up to me and said hi.
Well, that's great. And how do you feel about the experience of introducing programs to high school students versus undergraduates or graduate students? A lot of times I hear about programs that are, kind of geared at the undergrad level or the grad level.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like myself, even as an undergrad, I wasn't introduced to a lot of opportunities that were already existed. And so I feel like we need to build that pool up at a younger age. And so I feel like high school is when you can get them really interested in the different STEM fields. In our program, they can try different areas of science before they commit to one when they go to an undergrad institution. And then it really kind of gets them on that track to being in the STEM field. And then they're introduced to faculty, so with students learn how to engage and work with faculty. And I think that helps them feel more confident when they actually start at an institution, whether it's at Northern Arizona University or go to another institution.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think that's a great point to leave it on. I appreciate your time, and thank you for chatting with me.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Next, I had the chance to speak with Megan Fork, an assistant professor of biology at Westchester University, who joined me to discuss the EcoDive project, which is aimed at finding ways that conferences can better serve the needs of diverse organizations and individuals. Let's go to that interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Okay, so I was hoping we could talk a little bit about EcoDive. Can you give me a quick introduction to the program?
Yeah, so EcoDive is our acronym for a project that stands for Evaluating Conferences for Diverse Engagement.
Okay.
And our project has evolved over time. We're in our second year right now, funded by an NSF program that is seeking to kind of understand culture change in biological societies. Uh-huh. So we are focusing specifically on the conferences part of biological societies, and specifically on the kind of ecology, environmental biology side. And our goals are to understand how conferences can engage a more diverse set of people and a more diverse set of career paths for people in those fields.
That strikes me as incredibly important. I conduct occasionally these oral histories, oftentimes with very senior researchers, and they always come back to conferences as being, the most important thing where they made their most important connections of their careers and, began collaborations and things like that. So that sounds incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think we're kind of in this place, we saw during some of the COVID lockdowns when societies were doing their conferences online, we observed this change in the participation where kind of a more diverse set of people were able to participate, but so many people come away from those virtual conferences saying that this did not meet the needs that we have of kind of the networking and the social part. And
right.
So I think trying to think about ways that we can engage people who aren't always able to travel because
Sure.
of funding or family or carbon or whatever, and finding ways that we can just make everybody able to participate. So
Yeah, and actually accrue some of those benefits.
exactly.
What has happened in the project so far, and what's to come?
Yeah, great. So there are kind of under that program that funds us, there are 3 kinds of grants, and we're an evaluation grant. So
Sure.
really, we are our goal is to understand kind of where are we at. So we have 3 phases. The first one was to work with some of our partner societies to look at their conference attendance data.
Uh-huh.
So we got data from a bunch of societies looking at who was at their conferences between 2017 and 2022. So spanning that before, during, and after lockdowns.
Yeah.
To get a sense of did we see these same patterns that we've seen in other data in our ecology, environmental science, resource management fields.
Right.
So we are still kind of working on those data to see, but we definitely see some of the surprising things that we've seen are that for most conferences, the majority of people were one-time attendees. It was their first time
Oh, wow.
at a conference. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, that's so kind of bucks against the narrative that I feel at my societies and stuff like that. And then the second phase that we just finished are in the process of, but finished data collection yesterday, is a survey that we sent out to a bunch of people, both academics and people in a bunch of other kind of fields of work, industry, nonprofit, local and federal governments, all sorts of things, to get a sense of what are people getting out of conferences in general? What is the role of conferences in their career development? What are the barriers to participating? What do they look for in a conference? So we are getting ready to start analyzing those data. So I don't have a story to tell about that yet.
Sure.
And then in the future, the next thing we're going to do is use those data to inform some focus groups where we can get a better sense of okay, what can we kind of actively design into conferences to make them do the things for people so that we can get that diverse set of people joining.
No, that sounds incredibly valuable. And I'm just wondering, are you collecting any data here at SACNAS, or what's the operation going on?
Yeah, so I'm sort of collecting more qualitative data. So this is a vibes visit,
Sure.
But one of the things that we realized, one of the evolutions that we saw in our project over time was that we have invited a lot of people into our project to help guide us. We have a steering committee and an advisory board that both are working with us to kind of guide our data collection, making sure we're thoughtfully engaging the communities that we want to be. And part of the way through, we realized, it's not always a good practice to bring people into our space. And so I'm here as kind of our work recognize that we want to also go out and listen in the spaces where our communities are already engaging and already comfortable instead of trying to wrench them out and bring them to us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Less of an extractive model.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I wish you all the best with it, and I really appreciate your telling me about this program. It's been fantastic.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And next up is an interview that I'm very grateful to be able to share with you, given the strong focus on student work present at SACNAS. It's with Shania Gonzalez, who's a first-generation college student at Williams College in Massachusetts, where she studies psychology and neuroscience. Let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Of course. It's good to be here.
Okay, so you just mentioned to me before we started recording that you presented a poster, and can I ask you what it was about?
Yeah, so I conduct most of my research at Williams College, but I've spent the past summer at the University of Michigan in a lab that uses a mouse model of Alzheimer's disease to study cognitive resilience. And my main finding from the summer was that dendritic spine density, which is where neurons synapse along the receiving end of a neuron, that an increase in the density of those synapses can preserve cognitive function even in a mouse that has the Alzheimer's gene. So within the Alzheimer's population, dendritic spine density is a protective factor for cognition, and you see a significant difference between those that do not have preserved spine density. Their cognition is much lower, and those that have a higher spine density have much better memory.
Oh, that's really cool. And now the question that I have to ask is there a way to increase your dendritic spine density?
Yeah, that's, I guess, something that is definitely what future research should be geared toward.
That's the future work part of the conversation. So what are you working on now?
So now I'm doing a thesis back at Williams, and my lab is focused on fear extinction, which is the unlearning of fear conditioning. So the human analog would be exposure therapy. And basically, our lab's main premise is that fear extinction done across multiple days in multiple contexts, which vary by smell, like wall color, floor texture, stuff like that makes the mouse, because it's in mice, that makes the mouse feel like it's in a new place. Extinction done in multiple places prevents the return of fear at remote and distant time points. So basically what my current project is aiming to do is to map the memory trace of this fear extinction across time. So kind of comparing which cells are active during fear conditioning and which cells are active during the last day of fear extinction to see how the population can change. And
that's really cool. So is the idea that the mouse is conditioned to be fearful of a certain stimulus?
Yes.
And then it's extinguished by, do you expose the mouse to the stimulus again, but without whatever?
The reinforcer,
whatever the reinforcer, okay.
Yes.
And so then you're looking at, what element then do you measure?
You measure how much they freeze, which is just like their basic fear response is freezing. So you measure how much the association is between a tone and a shock, so it's classical Pavlovian conditioning, and you measure how much they freeze during the tone presentation. And
you're finding that providing that extinction phase with a different context has an effect?
Yes. So the paradigm is 5 days. The first 2 days are fear conditioning. They occur in one distinct context. And then over the next 3 days, it's fear extinction. So it's the exact same protocol of exposing them to the tone several times, but each day is in a different context. So what we find is that when we test for fear relapse, like 30 days or 48 hours after the last day of extinction, that in mice that have learned in multiple contexts as opposed to just one, they show much less freezing, so they remember and generalize the extinction memory much better.
Oh, that's really cool. And you can, of course, imagine all sorts of human applications.
Exactly, yeah.
Look forward to hearing more.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is this your first SACNAS conference?
This is my first SACNAS conference, yes. It's not my first conference, but it is my first affinity group-based conference.
Nice. How have you found this one?
This one was, I really like it. I think obviously there's this element of community that's not as present in the other ones. It's also my first time traveling to a conference alone. So usually I go with my lab at Williams, but since I wasn't presenting their research, I got funding from Michigan and from my psychology department at school to come here alone. So that's been very rewarding to just do the process by myself. And I also found that it's much less intimidating to go around and network when people are here for the specific reason of increasing representation in science. So I think that's really cool.
I should ask, have you been too busy to attend any sessions, or have you had any that you've enjoyed?
I've honestly, yes, I've been a bit busy. I've been spending most of my time at the tables with the grad schools because I'm a senior currently and I'm applying to grad school this cycle.
Right.
So my applications are due in a month. So I was kind of going around all the tables I'm interested in. I spent a good amount of time at the Harvard and Johns Hopkins tables. They had really good representatives there that were really willing to help. And I've also just been honestly really tired from traveling from the East Coast to here. And my first day I presented, I attended the networking lunch, and then I had to do some work, so I missed some sessions that day. But overall, I've gotten a lot just from like talking to people. I think that's been the most rewarding part.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me. I've appreciated learning about your science and your experience at the meeting. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Next, I had the opportunity to sit down with another featured speaker at the SACNAS conference. That was Dr. Jorge Jimenez, who's a bioengineer in the medical device sector, and he's from Phoenix, Arizona, and just recently moved back after spending some time in some other places. I'll let him tell you about that, though, so let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, happy to be here. It's been an exciting day.
Yeah, it has been. I really greatly enjoyed your talk, and I think we'll get into a few different topics. But one of the things I was interested in chatting about was, the ways that community and an organization like SACNAS can support people when they go through the types of pivots that you were discussing. Whether that be in a career space or even earlier in a student setting. How can that have an influence?
Yeah, so I discussed a little bit about pivoting in a PhD program. Sure. I stayed within my discipline, but I would call them stretch assignments or extra assignments that I took the initiative to start within my own discipline. And one example was the science policy journal that I submitted through a competition through the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And SACNAS was actually a contributing member to that journal that policy memo competition. So I think that is a way that we can get more students involved in understanding like how can you take like small steps outside of your domain that are multidisciplinary. So offering opportunities to either have like op-eds or small commentaries about the like research field that they're in or a like topic that the journal is interested in learning and hearing from either undergraduates or graduate students.
Great. And it sounds like there are a lot of opportunities. What are some of the bigger pivots that you've experienced in your career thus far?
Yeah, so I would say that the biggest pivot has been leaving and I put that in quotes, like leaving the academic space.
Right.
And I only say that as moving away from like pure benchtop research work into more of a technical manager role within the medical device industry.
Yeah. And
I think that's been the largest pivot, such that I don't do as much benchtop work anymore, but I still continue to analyze data and help design experiments. And I kind of said I put on quotes that I like left academia, but I guess I left the career ladder of academia.
Sure.
So a lot of the steps to become like a professor, all of those things are what I mean by stepping away.
Right. And what kind of work do you do on a day-to-day basis right now?
Yeah, so right now I work for a medical device company called Becton Dickinson and Company, and on the day-to-day I work in product development, and we have various teams that support the product development. So we have a marketing team, like a regulatory team, the R&D engineering team, and a few other cross-functional partners. So on a day-to-day basis, we will either meet with the entire cross-functional team to align on timelines and prioritization of our new project. And then from the R&D side, we have different levels of engineers that we work with. And so I have been running some technical work streams. So it's been managing those and then providing technical, almost like consultation in a way, to the business itself within our teams.
And what's the experience like been moving into industry from that traditional academic pipeline? Was it challenging, or did you feel comfortable? What was it?
Yeah, I think that I had like an internship when I was an undergraduate, so I understood some of the corporate business language. And I think the most challenging thing has been sort of identifying the difference between science questions and like product development.
Right.
And knowing that the product development cycle is to create an end product that meets the end user's needs. So from the healthcare perspective, that is a clinician. So realizing that the science is used for that, but we're not necessarily trying to answer scientific questions, right? We're trying to create a product that someone will use that will then have some return on investment. So knowing how much the business will prioritize that is also something that I've been like learning, and it's probably the most challenging thing. Then when you're in academia, you sort of write a grant or you have research dollars where you are committed to pursuing these research goals, but how you get there's a little bit, up to the project investigator.
Yeah. It's it's a different model.
Yeah.
So, in your case, you grew up in this area, the Phoenix area?
Yes, I grew up in the Phoenix area.
And this is a bit of a homecoming. What's that been like?
Yeah, it's been different. Arizona is not, Arizona is not the same. It's been very dynamic. I've been gone for about 8 years. And I went to the Arizona State University, which is local to Phoenix. And I think it's just an opportunity to reset and just remember kind of where I came from and what can I like provide for my community and folks at home. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And has it been a valuable time to sort of reconnect with community and get back into some of the the things that, because you've been in Salt Lake City for a while, right?
Yeah. So I was at the University of Pittsburgh for my PhD, and then I had my first role at BD in Salt Lake City, and then I'm part of a program called the Technology Leadership Development Program, and I essentially take 3 different rotations in the company with different roles. Right. So the first role was strategic innovation, and then in this role I'm more in the product development R&D landscape. So I think that I've been a couple months into the second portion of my rotation.
Right.
So I think it was just a lot of learning curves at first, but now that the dust has sort of settled, I've been able to do more things like come to SACNAS, or I'll be speaking at Arizona State University for their Society for Biomaterials Day later in November. So I think in terms of, like, I kind of quoted, I left academia, like I'm still sort of part of it, but I'm just providing the professional lens of it. Since not all students go to grad school, right? There's still like a whole bunch of students who are interested in industry-like roles.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And thank you very much for chatting with me today. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great questions.
And now, last but certainly not least, is Anthony Dant, who's a 5th-year PhD candidate at the University of Arizona. He presented on the Our Future is Science program at the conference and was gracious enough to discuss it with me as well. Before I share that discussion, though, a final quick thank you to SACNAS for making all of this possible. We had a great time. And now, let's go to the interview. Thank you for chatting with me today.
Nope, my pleasure.
Okay, so we're talking a little bit about Our Future is Science and your presentation there on today. Could you give me a quick introduction to the program? How does it work?
Yeah, so Our Future is Science, which is a nonprofit that is kind of umbrellaed from the Aspen Institute, is an organization that is trying to connect the pieces of both science and social justice. And what I mean by this is to try to help future researchers, such as PhD students like myself, and high school students, being able to recognize what specifically in social science is being or social justice is being influenced by science, and then vice versa. And ultimately, this organization is trying to pair together mentors and mentees, in which case being high school students and PhD students, into creating capstone projects related to social justice and science.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about, what one of those capstone projects might be? If you've got an example, let's go with it, because I'm really curious about how all this comes together.
Yeah. So I was a mentor when I first started at OFIS, which is the abbreviation for our Future of Science.
Got it.
And I worked with 3 high school students from New York City. And they had actually already, and they were remarkable students, a idea to work in regards to public health in relation to air quality across the city.
Okay.
And they were really dedicated in trying to understand the link between social justice and inequality across New York City in regards to racial diversity, and how the exposure of air quality around the city might be linked to differences in cardiovascular disease, pulmonary diseases. And they were able to create a large amount of outputs, including a website, being able to take surveys across the city themselves, reaching out to medical and political personnel for just this project themselves. So as a high school student, you would imagine that's a pretty daunting thing to do.
Yes.
Yes. So ultimately being able to not only have these things like a website and being able to say that I have contacted my local officials to ask about these things affecting my community, but also being able to link together both a scientific element such as air quality and potential amounts of air quality in cardiovascular diseases, and linking that to racial inequality across New York City.
That's incredibly exciting research. And, from my layperson's understanding, that's an utterly unappreciated and understudied topic.
Yeah. And I think and the program itself is not limited to public health.
Uh-huh.
It is a large breadth of biological questions and relating to social justice. So for me personally, I study urban eco-evolutionary dynamics.
Uh-huh.
So I specifically work with annual plants and how they change in response to urban spatial heterogeneity across urban mosaics. I specifically work in California, and I have had no kind of prior affiliation with public health. So
right.
Being matched with these mentees, I was able to help with some of the spatial analytical portions of air quality and things like that. But also just being a driver of just how research should be done. What are the things that they might be approaching in terms of their question, the problems they might be running into? And it gave me an opportunity, which I feel like a lot of graduate students may not have, in terms of being a mentor outside of the PhD greater kind of organization they might be in.
That's really cool. And, that actually raises a question that I've been thinking about since Jyotsna mentioned your presentation to me, which is, what drove the mentor-mentee, being a PhD candidate obviously makes sense for mentorship position, but then why high school students? I think when I've typically heard about mentorship programs at universities, it tends to be an undergraduate matched with either somebody who's long in their career or a PhD student or something like that. How did this arrangement get kind of put together?
Yeah, so basically the way that the format the program is currently is that we do have these mentees, which are high school students, and the PhD students, which are the mentors, but then we also have a third position called ambassadors.
Okay.
And that's something that I am currently. I'm a second year ambassador at this point. So I've done a mentoring year, I've done an ambassador year, and it's the second year of my ambassador program. And ultimately what the ambassadors do is that they can either be a mentor who finished and wanted to stay with the program, which is something that I wanted to do, or they are a high school student who is now in their undergraduate and
right.
is now serving as an ambassador. So we still have that connection to the undergraduate at that point. But to kind of answer your terms of why high school students, we want to give students the opportunity that may have not had a large breadth of either possibilities in regards to their education or other outreach. And we feel that high school students are kind of that beginning key of having students being motivated not only in science, but being able to connect science to the community around them. And high school students, I feel like, are able to, even though they have like 1,000 things going on with their tests and applying for colleges and stuff like that, not to say that undergraduates don't, but they are at a position that they may recognize that they find a major in college that they really like based on this program. They might be able to recognize that, oh, I have now a lot of ability to have public speaking skills and now can transfer that to my own undergraduate facilities. And we feel like high schoolers in general just have this really wonderful opportunity to begin the stages of their scientific career, and that's a really great place for the mentors to really be adding to that.
It sounds like just the perfect spot, and I appreciate your sharing it with me. I've got one more question for you, which is, what's the experience been like at this meeting so far, and what's it been like to present here, say versus another conference?
Yeah, this is my first time at SACNAS.
Me too.
And and it's been absolutely wonderful being here. I think one of the things that I've really appreciated is this sense of all research is welcome here.
Yeah.
When I was at the poster session, I was very surprised to see just the wide breadth of all this diversity of research that's being done. Anything from the biological sciences to social inequalities to public health. And that's something that I've really appreciated to see in terms of the academic diversity, but also just in terms of just the community diversity that is right here. I grew up in Los Angeles in a Mexican American household that I'm the first member of my family to go to graduate school, to obtain a PhD, and being in these spaces where a lot of people have the same kind of history and kind of development as myself is really refreshing to see. And I feel like sometimes that can be lost in larger conferences where some people often may have different trajectories, which is totally fine. Mm-hmm. But being able to kind of communicate, find individuals like that is a really wonderful opportunity.
That's great. And thank you very much for sitting down with me.
No problem.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.